Imagine this. You are Alina, a trembling 16-year-old bride, standing alone in a cold, drafty stone chamber. It's the year 1342, and tonight is your wedding night. The flickering candlelight casts long shadows across the rough-hewn walls, but the darkness in the room isn't your only fear. Beyond the heavy wooden door, you hear the muffled laughter and crude jests of 20 wedding guests who refuse to leave until they hear proof of what's about to happen. Your new husband, Sir Geoffrey, a man 3 times your age with breath like sour ale and teeth blackened by decay, steps closer, clutching a bloodied cloth in his gnarled hands. His eyes gleam with expectation, but not of love or tenderness, only duty. This isn't just about you and him. Outside, the village priest waits with a manual of approved sexual positions, ready to interrogate you at dawn about every detail of this night. If you choose the wrong position, if you show too much pleasure, or if you fail to bleed enough, you could be branded a witch and burned at the stake. Your mother's whispered warnings echo in your mind. Child, your body belongs to God, the church, and your husband, never to you. This isn't an isolated nightmare. This is the systematic reality of medieval intimacy, where the most private moments of human life were governed by rules so invasive, so twisted, they would horrify us today. This was not just about religion or tradition, it was about control so absolute that it reached into the marriage bed itself, turning love into a legal procedure and pleasure into potential damnation. Tonight, we're diving into the most disturbing sexual practices of the medieval era, not just the bizarre customs you might expect, but the ways an entire civilization weaponized intimacy against its own people. We'll uncover how the church turned bedrooms into courtrooms, how communities made private moments public spectacles, and how the most natural human desires became sources of terror and shame. If this journey into history's hidden darkness moves you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so we can keep unearthing these forgotten truths together. Let's honor the voices of those who suffered by ensuring their stories are heard. To understand the horror of Alina's world, we must grasp how completely the church controlled every aspect of intimate life in medieval Europe. Your bedroom wasn't yours. It belonged to God, monitored by priests, and regulated by laws that turned natural impulses into potential crimes against heaven. The church didn't just influence sexual behavior, it micromanaged it with terrifying precision. As early as the 4th century, St. Jerome declared that a man who loved his wife too passionately was an adulterer. This wasn't a poetic metaphor, it was doctrine that shaped intimate life for 1,000 years. By the 13th century, theologians like Thomas Aquinas had codified these beliefs into explicit rules governing when, how, and why married couples could touch each other. Sexual intercourse was only permissible on certain days. Monday through Wednesday were forbidden as preparation for religious observances. Thursday commemorated Christ's arrest, Friday his crucifixion, and Saturday honored the Virgin Mary, all off-limits. Sunday belonged entirely to God. This left Tuesday and parts of Thursday, but even those days came with restrictions. Sex was banned during Lent, Advent, Whitsun week, Easter week, and the month before Christmas. It was also forbidden during menstruation, pregnancy, or nursing, and never allowed during daylight hours or if either partner had impure thoughts. When all restrictions were tallied, medieval couples could legitimately have sex on roughly 50 days per year. But the rules went deeper than timing. The church taught that only one sexual position was acceptable, man on top, woman beneath, face to face, known today as the missionary position. Any deviation was considered against nature and sinful. Oral contact, manual stimulation, and even excessive kissing could lead to confession and penance. The church viewed pleasure itself with suspicion, especially for women. Virtuous wives were expected to endure sex as a duty, not enjoy it. Any woman who admitted to pleasure during confession risked accusations of witchcraft, as the church believed that only sinful or demonic influence could explain such feelings. These rules weren't abstract theology, they were enforced through a system of surveillance and punishment. Priests conducted regular interrogations during confession, asking married couples detailed questions about their sexual practices. What positions did you use? How often did you have intercourse? Did you feel pleasure? These weren't casual inquiries. They were legal investigations backed by the threat of public penance, excommunication, or worse. The medieval medical establishment reinforced these restrictions with pseudoscientific theories. Physicians, trained in church-dominated universities, believed women were defective versions of men. They taught that the vagina was an inverted penis and the ovaries were internal testicles. Female sexuality was seen as inherently dangerous, a chaotic force that needed strict regulation to prevent societal collapse. These weren't fringe ideas, they were the foundation of medieval medicine, taught across Europe and enforced through legal systems that made sexual transgression a matter of life and death. For young brides like Elena, the wedding night was not a private moment of intimacy, but a public performance with an audience demanding proof. The bedding ceremony was a ritualized ordeal that began long before the couple was alone. Wedding guests, often drunk and rowdy, would escort the bride and groom to their chamber, undressing them while singing crude songs and shouting lewd encouragements. Once the couple was in bed, the guests positioned themselves outside the door, listening for the sounds that would make the marriage legally binding. The most disturbing aspect of this ritual was the expectation of pain. Elena's cries were considered legal evidence that her hymen had been broken, proving her virginity and the marriage's consummation. The bloodied sheets, displayed to the crowd the next morning, were the final proof of her purity and the marriage's legitimacy. If no blood appeared, the consequences could be catastrophic. A bride might be returned to her family in disgrace, branded as unchaste, or even executed for fraud. The pressure was so intense that many brides resorted to desperate measures, pricking their fingers, hiding animal blood, or using sharp objects to tear their hymens beforehand to ensure they would bleed. The Church's misunderstanding of female anatomy fueled this obsession with blood. Medieval physicians believed the hymen was a solid barrier that completely sealed the vaginal opening, when in reality it's a flexible, partial membrane that can be torn by normal activities like horseback riding or physical labor. This ignorance turned natural variations in physiology into evidence of moral failure, placing impossible burdens on young women. The Church's control didn't end with the wedding night. Priests routinely interrogated married couples during confession, using detailed manuals that listed hundreds of specific sexual practices and their corresponding penances. A couple who had sex on a forbidden day might face weeks of fasting. Those who used unapproved positions could be sentenced to months of public penance, forced to stand outside the church in sackcloth or perform humiliating acts of atonement. Women who admitted to experiencing pleasure were often suspected of witchcraft, as the church taught that virtuous women should endure, not enjoy, their marital duties. These interrogations weren't private spiritual discussions, they were public spectacles designed to shame and control. In some cases, priests would summon neighbors to testify about what they had heard through bedroom walls, turning intimate moments into community gossip and legal evidence. Beyond married couples, medieval people lived in terror of sexual demons believed to prey on humans during their most vulnerable moments. The succubus and incubus weren't folklore, they were accepted as medical and theological facts. Church authorities taught that these demons could take human form to seduce men and women, stealing their life force through sexual intercourse. Theologians developed elaborate theories about how these demons operated. A demon could first take female form to collect seed from a man, then transform into male form to impregnate a woman with the stolen essence. Any child born from such a union was believed to be cursed or demonic. Women who reported sexual dreams or unexplained physical sensations were often accused of consorting with demons. Sleep paralysis, now understood as a neurological phenomenon, was interpreted as demonic sexual assault. Men and women who woke unable to move, often with sensations of pressure on their chest, were believed to be under demonic attack. The Church prescribed elaborate rituals of exorcism and purification, but many suspected victims were burned as witches instead. The medieval understanding of menstruation added another layer of terror to female sexuality. Menstrual blood was believed to be so toxic that it could kill crops, sour wine, and cause men to lose their strength. Women during their monthly cycles were considered dangerous pollutants who had to be isolated from society. They couldn't enter churches, prepare food, or touch sacred objects. Many villages, menstruating women were required to live in special huts outside the community until their bleeding stopped. The church taught that menstruation was God's punishment for Eve's original sin, making every monthly cycle a reminder of feminine shame. Medieval physicians believed that menstrual blood that wasn't properly expelled would accumulate and poison the woman from within. They prescribed dangerous treatments like bloodletting and purging to balance what they called the female humors. Meanwhile, medieval women developed secret knowledge about managing their cycles, using moss, cloth, rags, and sheepskin as primitive protection. They tracked their cycles by lunar phases and developed herbal remedies to ease pain and regulate flow. This knowledge was passed down through generations of women, carefully hidden from male physicians and church authorities who might condemn it as witchcraft. The systematic control of medieval sexuality wasn't accidental. It was a carefully constructed system designed to maintain social order through the most intimate aspects of human life. The church understood that controlling sexual behavior meant controlling the fundamental building blocks of society: marriage, family, and reproduction. Medieval marriage wasn't about love or personal fulfillment. It was a political and economic arrangement where bodies became territories to be conquered, defended, and traded. When Alina's father arranged her marriage to Sir Geoffrey, her virginity was her dowry, more valuable than gold or livestock. The hymen became a currency of honor, traded between families as proof of their daughter's purity and their own reputation. The legal system reflected these sexual anxieties in its treatment of rape, adultery, and sexual assault. Rape wasn't defined as a crime against the woman, but as a crime against the man who owned her, her father, husband, or lord. The punishment for rape varied dramatically depending on the social status of both victim and perpetrator. A nobleman who assaulted a peasant woman might pay a small fine, while a peasant who attacked a noblewoman would face torture and death. Adultery was punished even more severely, but only for women. A married woman who had relations with any man other than her husband could be killed by her husband with no legal consequences. Medieval law codes specifically granted husbands the right to murder adulterous wives and their lovers if caught in the act. Men, however, were generally free to have relations with unmarried women, servants, or prostitutes without legal repercussions. Since marriage wasn't considered binding until sexual intercourse occurred, proving or disproving consummation became a matter of legal inquiry. Church courts would examine both husband and wife, interviewing them separately about intimate details of their wedding night. They would inspect the woman's body for signs of penetration and question neighbors about what they had heard through bedroom walls. These investigations could lead to annulments, public shamming, or accusations of fraud. The medieval period also saw the development of elaborate theories about sexual compatibility based on astrological signs, bodily humors, and physical characteristics. Physicians believed that sexual pleasure and fertility depended on the proper balance of hot and cold, wet and dry humors in both partners. A hot husband might be incompatible with a cold wife, leading to dysfunction and infertility. Physical examinations of potential spouses were common among wealthy families. Physicians would examine the bride's body for signs of her sexual temperament. Wide hips indicated fertility, while narrow hips suggested barrenness. The groom's anatomy was analyzed for compatibility with his intended bride. These examinations were conducted with the same clinical detachment used for examining livestock. The church also developed theories about sexual compatibility based on spiritual rather than physical characteristics. They taught that couples who were too closely related, either by blood or spiritual kinship, such as godparents, would be cursed with dysfunction and monstrous children. The complex rules of consanguinity meant that many medieval marriages were later annulled when previously unknown family connections were discovered. This wasn't just social control, it was the weaponization of intimacy itself, turning the most private human experiences into public matters of law, religion, and social standing. The human cost of these practices becomes clear when we examine the stories of individual women who fell victim to medieval sexual paranoia. Consider Isabella of Normandy, whose wedding night in 1367 became a nightmare that haunted her for the rest of her short life. Isabella was 14 when she married Lord Robert, a man of 43 who had already buried 2 previous wives. The bedding ceremony proceeded as expected, with guests undressing the couple and positioning themselves outside the chamber door. But when morning came, the expected bloodied sheets were nowhere to be found. Isabella's new mother-in-law immediately accused her of arriving at the marriage unchaste. The family called in the village priest to examine Isabella's body. In front of a room full of witnesses, she was forced to submit to an invasive physical inspection designed to determine whether she was truly a virgin. The priest's conclusion was damning. Isabella's hymen was already torn, which in medieval understanding meant she had definitely engaged in sexual relations before marriage. The accusation destroyed Isabella's life. Her own family refused to take her back, claiming she had brought shame upon their name. Lord Robert's family demanded compensation for the fraud, threatening to have Isabella tried as a witch if payment wasn't forthcoming. Isabella found herself trapped in a marriage where she was treated as damaged goods, constantly reminded of her supposed sin. The truth, which medieval medicine couldn't understand, was that Isabella's hymen had been torn years earlier during a riding accident. But in a world where female anatomy was completely misunderstood, natural variations in physiology became evidence of moral corruption. Isabella died 3 years later during childbirth, still branded as the woman who had deceived her husband on their wedding night. Even more tragic was the fate of Agnes the Weaver, a young woman from a small English village who made the mistake of reporting her sexual dreams to a priest during confession. Agnes, barely 18, had been experiencing vivid nighttime visions that left her feeling confused and frightened. Seeking spiritual guidance, she described these dreams to Father Benedict during her weekly confession. Father Benedict immediately recognized the symptoms of demonic visitation. According to church doctrine, Agnes's dreams were proof that she had been seduced by an incubus, a male demon who preyed on young women through sexual dreams. The priest began an investigation that would ultimately destroy Agnes's life and end with her death. The inquiry started with detailed interrogations about Agnes's dreams. Father Benedict demanded explicit descriptions of what had occurred, who had appeared to her, and what physical sensations she had experienced. Agnes, terrified and confused, tried to answer honestly, not understanding that her words were being used to build a case against her. The investigation expanded to include Agnes's neighbors, who were questioned about her behavior, her companions, and any signs of supernatural activity around her home. Medieval communities were hotbeds of gossip and suspicion, and several villagers came forward with stories of strange sounds, unexplained lights, and other phenomena they now attributed to Agnes's alleged demonic activities. The final evidence came when Agnes was subjected to a physical examination by a group of church authorities and local physicians. They claimed to find marks on her body that proved demonic contact, small blemishes, moles, and scars that were interpreted as signs left by supernatural lovers. Agnes tried to explain that these were natural marks she had carried since childhood, but medieval superstition made logical explanation impossible. Agnes was tried as a witch and burned alive in the village square. Her crime was reporting sexual dreams to a priest who interpreted natural human sexuality through the lens of demonic possession. Her death served as a warning to other young women about the dangers of seeking spiritual guidance for perfectly normal human experiences. These stories reveal the true horror of medieval sexual practices. They turned natural human sexuality into evidence of moral corruption, spiritual contamination, and supernatural evil. The systematic sexual oppression of medieval Europe didn't end with the Middle Ages. Its influence echoed through centuries of European culture, shaping attitudes about sexuality, gender, and bodily autonomy that persist in various forms today. The Church's weaponization of intimacy created psychological and social patterns that proved remarkably durable. The medieval period established the principle that sexual pleasure was inherently suspicious, especially for women. This belief system created generations of people who viewed their own natural desires as sources of shame and potential damnation. The idea that virtuous women shouldn't enjoy physical intimacy became so deeply embedded in European culture that it influenced medical practice, legal systems, and social expectations well into the 20th century. The practice of public verification of sexual activity established precedents for community surveillance of private behavior that would reappear throughout European history. The Spanish Inquisition expanded these methods, using torture to extract confessions about sexual practices from suspected heretics. The witch trials of the early modern period drew directly on medieval techniques for identifying and prosecuting sexual deviants. Medieval marriage laws created legal frameworks that treated women as property rather than individuals. These principles influenced European colonial expansion, with settlers carrying medieval attitudes about sexuality, marriage, and gender roles to other continents. The legal subjugation of women's sexual autonomy became a cornerstone of patriarchal systems that span the globe. The medical establishment's fundamental misunderstanding of female anatomy had consequences that lasted for centuries. Medieval beliefs about women's bodies influenced medical practice through the Renaissance and into the modern era. The idea that women were defective versions of men continued to shape medical education and treatment well into the 19th century. Perhaps most tragically, the medieval period normalized the idea that sexual violence against women was a property crime rather than a personal assault. This legal framework influenced the development of rape laws throughout Europe and its colonies. The principle that a woman's sexual value belonged to her male relatives rather than herself became embedded in legal systems that required centuries of struggle to reform. The psychological impact of medieval sexual practices extended far beyond their immediate victims. Children raised in households where intimacy was governed by fear and suspicion learned to view their own sexuality as dangerous and shameful. These attitudes were passed down through generations, creating cycles of sexual dysfunction and emotional trauma that affected entire cultures. The medieval period proved that sexual repression could be used as a tool of social control, more powerful than economic exploitation or physical violence. By making people afraid of their own bodies and desires, authorities could maintain order without constant surveillance or punishment. The fundamental mechanisms that enabled medieval sexual oppression haven't disappeared from modern society. They've simply evolved into more sophisticated forms that are harder to recognize but equally destructive. Understanding how medieval authorities weaponized intimacy provides crucial insights into contemporary struggles for sexual freedom and bodily autonomy. The medieval church's detailed regulation of sexual positions and practices finds disturbing parallels in modern attempts to legislate intimate behavior. Contemporary debates about contraception, reproductive rights, and sexual education often employ the same logic that medieval authorities used to justify their intrusion into private bedrooms. The principle that religious or governmental authorities should determine acceptable sexual practices remains a powerful force in many societies. The medieval practice of community surveillance of sexual behavior has been enhanced rather than eliminated by modern technology. Digital communications create permanent records of intimate conversations and relationships. Social media allows communities to monitor and judge private behavior with unprecedented precision. The same psychological mechanisms that allowed medieval neighbors to police each other's sexuality operate today through online platforms and digital surveillance. The medieval belief that women's sexual experiences belong to their male relatives rather than themselves persists in modified forms throughout the world. Honor-based violence, forced marriage, and legal systems that treat sexual assault as property crimes all draw on medieval precedents. The fundamental question of who controls women's sexual autonomy remains contentious in many societies. Perhaps most troublingly, the medieval use of sexual shame as a tool of social control has been amplified by modern media and technology. The ability to document, distribute, and permanently preserve intimate moments creates new opportunities for the kind of sexual humiliation that medieval authorities used to maintain order. The weaponization of sexuality against political opponents, social minorities, and anyone who challenges authority follows patterns established in medieval Europe. The international nature of modern society has created new opportunities for sexual exploitation, while making accountability more difficult to achieve through jurisdictional complexity and institutional fragmentation. Return with me now to that cold stone chamber where young Elena stands trembling before her wedding night ordeal. In her terror, we see not just one woman suffering, but the culmination of an entire civilization's systematic assault on human sexuality. Her story represents thousands of women whose most intimate moments were transformed into public spectacles of control and humiliation. The medieval period created sexual practices so disturbing that they challenge our understanding of human cruelty. These weren't the products of ignorance or primitive thinking. They were sophisticated systems of oppression designed by intelligent people who understood exactly how to use shame, fear, and religious authority to control the most fundamental aspects of human experience. Elena's wedding night wasn't about love, pleasure, or even reproduction. It was about power. The power to determine who could touch whom, when, and how. The power to transform natural human desires into evidence of spiritual corruption. The power to make people afraid of their own bodies and suspicious of their own feelings. The bloodied sheets that Elena's community demanded weren't just proof of consummation. They were symbols of a society that had successfully weaponized intimacy itself. In forcing women to display the evidence of their sexual experiences, medieval authorities turned the most private human moments into public declarations of submission. The candles may have been extinguished in Elena's chamber centuries ago, but the questions her story raises about sexual autonomy, bodily ownership, and the limits of institutional control remain as urgent today as they were in medieval Europe. Her suffering reminds us that the struggle for sexual freedom isn't a modern invention, but an ancient human aspiration that transcends any particular historical moment. In remembering these forgotten victims of sexual oppression, we honor not just their memory, but our obligation to ensure that intimacy remains a source of joy rather than terror, connection rather than control. If this glimpse into history's hidden darkness has left you wanting to uncover more buried truths, I've prepared another journey into the shadows of the past that you won't want to miss. Click on the video appearing on your screen now to discover another shocking chapter that history tried to erase. And if you found this exploration as compelling as I did, hit that subscribe button so we can continue peeling back the layers of history together. These forgotten voices deserve to be heard, and there are so many more stories waiting to be told. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to know the truth, and join our community of truth seekers by subscribing. Together, we can shine a light on the past and ensure that the lessons of history guide us toward a future where no one has to live in fear of their own body. Let's keep these stories alive, because the past isn't just history, it's a warning and a call to action.